afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Partners webinar for the 2022 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. I am Katie Ertel, a hydrologist at the National Water Center, and I'm going to start the presentation today by giving a general overview and update of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi, Souris River, Red River of the North, and Great Lakes Basins. After that, we'll hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. This webinar is going to be recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access that recording. But if you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI here, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentations. All right, so let's get started. If we take a look at our first slide, we're going to begin this afternoon by looking at winter precipitation so far across the Greater Mississippi Basin and how it compares to last year. So a couple of differences can be seen this year in that center graphic to last year on the graphic on the right. The most noticeable of those differences is across the northern plains and the mid-Mississippi Valley and into the Ohio Valley, where you're seeing those blue and green colors there. Those regions have seen above normal precipitation, even 200+% of mean, and northern Minnesota there for this 2022 winter season so far. So very different from last year. Across the remainder of the Mississippi Basin, we are drier than last year, though, and we're seeing those deeper oranges and even reds indicating below normal precipitation for the season. If we shift our focus now to the graphic on the left there, this is the precipitation percent of mean over the last 2 weeks. You can see additional precipitation, as indicated again by those blue colors, did help to continue that trend of above normal precipitation over the mid-Mississippi and Ohio Valley. We also saw a period of wet weather and above normal precipitation over the last 2 weeks across portions of Montana, Colorado, and then across northern Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. We move on to the next slide. The graphic on the left is again looking at the last 2 weeks. So northern portions of the basin have seen cooler than average temperatures, especially in eastern North Dakota and northern Minnesota. Those cooler temperatures recently across the northern plains, the Midwest, and even into the Ohio Valley this year did continue and will continue to heighten the concern for ice development and ice jam flooding, which the river forecast centers will cover on later in the presentation. Seasonally, however, this year is almost a flipped image from last year. So comparing those two graphics on the right, this year is much colder across the northern plains and then warmer across the remainder of the basin, with departures from mean ranging from 2 to 4 degrees above. Next slide, we're going to take a look at the snow water content that is going on across the basin. So how much water that snowpack is holding currently. So on the left, you're going to see both the current snow water equivalent graphic as well as that same graphic from 2 weeks ago. So if we compare these two images, you can see that there's been an increase of snow water content over the last 2 weeks, especially across the Arrowhead region of Minnesota there. So further south, we did melt out some of that snowpack that was present across the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley over the last 2 weeks. But now we're seeing just a trace up to an inch maybe of snow water content a little further south of those areas. So that's reflective of that storm that is impacting that area yesterday and into today as well. However, overall, compared to last year, we do have more snow water content across the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes Basin. So Mike from North Central River Forecast Center will go more into what this means for flooding in that region later in the presentation. Next slide, we're going to look at soil moisture across the basin. So compared to last year, soil moisture content is elevated across the middle Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee valleys, which coincides well with those areas of above precipitation we saw just a few slides ago. Compared to last year, there are portions of eastern Dakota and western Minnesota where a couple of late rounds of late season precipitation before the winter freeze did lock in more saturated soils. So those green areas highlighted on the graphic on the left. However, we are looking at a very different story across the upper Missouri. This area saw a prolonged dry period leading into the winter, and as we saw earlier, has received very little winter precipitation this season so far. Of note, we are also seeing lower soil moisture content across portions of the upper Midwest, Central Plains, and the Arkansas Red and lower Mississippi valleys, which takes us to our next slide. the most recent U.S. drought monitor released just this morning across most of the western portions of the greater Mississippi Basin. You can see those widespread dry conditions and even areas of extreme drought that are present now. So this is very different from last year. We were only seeing some isolated pockets of abnormally dry areas and severe drought, again, isolated pockets going into the spring. On the next slide, we're going to take a look at our stream flows across the basin. So this is the USGS 7-day average stream flow map. Across the mid-Mississippi and into the Ohio Basin, average stream flows are now much above normal to even high in some areas there. So an expected increase with that precipitation that we've seen. This is a rather big difference from last year. You can see in that graphic on the lower right, where northern portions of the Ohio Basin were experiencing below normal 7-day average stream flows. Across the remainder of the Mississippi Basin, with the exception of some of those areas that we did see highlighted on the drought monitor on the last slide, most stream flows are normal to slightly above normal. So that green color that dominates the map there. You'll also notice the white sections in the upper Midwest and Northern Plains. That's where we're iced in or where seasonal gauges are not currently taking measurements. If we move on to the next slide, this information comes from the Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District. Elevated water levels do have an impact on flooding of inland streams and rivers, so we wanted to highlight this. This outlook is based off of the February 6-month forecast, which forecasts for months between February and July. So to sum it all up, besides Lake Superior, all lakes are currently above their long-term average levels. However, they are forecast to remain well below record high levels moving into the spring and early summer. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to look at the precipitation and temperature forecasts and also the climate outlooks that are going to influence our river outlooks looking into the spring. So on this slide, the majority of that light precipitation that you're seeing in this 7-day graphic, as well as some lingering snow showers that I mentioned across the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley there, are going to wrap up this evening and as we go into the weekend. And then we're going to see some dry conditions expected across the entire basin for the rest of that 7-day period. So starting beginning of the work week next week. I did want to point out that we do have rivers across the mid to lower Mississippi, the Tennessee valleys, and the Ohio Valley that are rising or already in minor or moderate flood stage. And many of those points, even with the dry reprieve we're going to see, are going to remain elevated into next week as those flood waves continue to route through the system. So we'll especially see the Ohio and Mississippi main stem stay elevated for quite some time now. If we move on to the next slide, this is the Week 2 outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. They are calling for an increased probability of above normal temperatures across much of the basin, but probabilities are leaning towards below normal temperatures next week as you move into the Northern Plains, Upper Midwest, and Great Lakes regions there. For precipitation in Week 2, the Climate Prediction Center predicts that northern portions of the greater Mississippi Basin are leaning towards above normal probabilities for precipitation, while southern portions are leaning towards near normal or even below normal probabilities for precipitation. So potentially good news in terms of those recessions and as that water routes through the system across those areas where we were seeing flooding on the previous slide. And next, we're going to look out a little further at the latest seasonal outlooks that are taking us through May now. As expected, probabilities favor above normal temperatures across the majority of the U.S. as we move into spring. And as is common in a La Nina pattern, which we're in right now, probabilities also show that above normal precipitation chances are going to gradually shift into the mid-Mississippi and Ohio Valley, which will be extremely important to watch as many of those basins, as you saw on the last few slides, are very vulnerable to additional flooding. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Basin to go into more depth on the potential for spring flooding across his region.
All right, thank you, Katie. And if we move on to the next slide, as Katie was mentioning, we do have minor to moderate flooding kind of scattered across a good portion of the Ohio Valley right now, from storm systems that really began last week and have continued this week. So we do at least have minor flooding scattered from Pennsylvania through Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as some minor to moderate flooding ongoing in Indiana and Southeast Illinois. That is expected to continue at least into portions of next week. The good news is from the storm system last week, the snow and the ice have been released for the most part from the Ohio Valley. We do expect a little bit of additional snow here coming up over the next day or two, but really going forward, ice and snow are not going to be the main contributors to our flood risk in the Ohio and Cumberland basins. It'll in fact be a future rainfall. Some of the indications, like Katie was showing, is that we are looking for a little bit of a reprieve as we start March in the Ohio Valley. However, it looks like towards the end of that week 2, kind of going into almost the middle of March, it looks to get quite active again in the Ohio, Cumberland, even down into the Tennessee Basin. So we are not out of our flood season. In fact, usually March is the peak flood season in the Ohio Valley, and then really either side of that by a month is also our active flood season. So really from February through April tends to be the peak active season in our area. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about what we're expecting. This map here is showing at least a 50% chance category for flooding. And so anything that you see in orange is at least a 50% chance of minor flooding. The red would be at least a 50% chance of moderate flooding. And then the few purples that you also see down in Kentucky would be at least a 50% chance of major flooding. And this really goes through April. And again, that's what we're really thinking right now. The next 60 days is the main flood risk for the Ohio and Cumberland basins. So a fairly widespread minor to moderate flood risk is anticipated. Moving on to the next slide, but what we also like to look at is the 25% chance, because this is really what's possible. And you can see that there is real risk for the active flooding conditions to continue on and off through April. And we're expecting at least some moderate flooding. It really looks like across most of the states in the Ohio Basin, from Ohio, Indiana, Southeast Illinois, Kentucky, even down into Tennessee. The exception would be the Upper Ohio Basin, more in the minor category is possible right now. But again, that can always change with one of those individual storm systems. So let's break it down just a little bit further on the next slide as we'll look at the Ohio Basin, mainly north of the Ohio River. And we're expecting minor to moderate flooding in Southeast Illinois, Indiana, and parts of Ohio, including the Maumee Basin in Northwest Ohio and Northeast Indiana, the White and East Fork of the White Basins in Indiana, the Wabash Basin in Indiana and Illinois, as well as the Patoka River in southern Indiana and the Embra River in east central Illinois. And some of the places in southeastern Illinois, even though we're expecting minor to moderate flooding, I colored the Little Wabash and the Skillet Fork as purple there because there's the possibility on that previous graphic of reaching major flood level. Moving further over into western Pennsylvania, and Ohio, we are also expecting the Great Miami River, the Scioto, the Muskingum, the Beaver rivers all expect at least some minor to possibly moderate flooding, as well as the rivers draining into Lake Erie. And then in northwestern Pennsylvania, the upper Allegheny Basin could experience some additional minor flooding in addition to what is already ongoing in northwestern Pennsylvania. Moving on to the next slide as we shift our focus to the south of the Ohio River and along the Ohio River in Kentucky and Tennessee. Certainly here it's been very wet, and some of the indications are that it'll get very active again here in about a week and a half or 2 weeks from now. So we are expecting moderate flooding in the Green River Basin in western Kentucky, and potentially moderate or even major flooding in the Kentucky River Basin in Kentucky. And then minor to moderate flooding in the Licking, Cumberland, Little Sandy, Monongahela Basin over in northern West Virginia, and also the Kanawha Basin in northern West Virginia. So really stretching from West Virginia through Kentucky into Tennessee, it does look like to be an active area, which is not an uncommon thing during our peak flood season. Along the Ohio River itself, we are expecting minor flooding below Point Pleasant, West Virginia. So that's a good portion of the Ohio River itself. And there's certainly a possibility of minor to even some moderate flooding, really anywhere along the Ohio, depending on how each one of these individual storm systems moves through the area over the next 2 months. So moving on to our final slide to wrap it up for the Ohio and Cumberland Basin, our flood risk has not changed from our last outlook. We are expecting the flood risk to be generally above normal for most of the Ohio Valley into April. Minor to moderate flooding is expected to continue on and off into April across a good portion of the Ohio Valley, but we do expect this flood risk to drop significantly by May. Isolated major flooding is possible, and that focus area right now that we're trying to key in on would be southeastern Illinois, southern Indiana into Kentucky over the next 60 days as the greatest risk. As I said earlier, snow and ice jams are no longer really a significant concern for our area. Again, we could add a little bit of snow, but it's not going to be a major player anymore, as all of that snow and ice, for the most part, has been released. There's a little bit of ice jams and ice action right up near the northern tier of our area, but again, it's pretty minor now, and we're not really concerned. Like we said 2 weeks ago, the flood risk is certainly above 2021, but not as high as years like 2011 or 2018. And again, finally, the rainfall and thunderstorms from the future storms that we see coming in about 2 or 3 weeks from now and going forward even into early April will be the main contributor to our flood risk. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike at the North Central River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the upper Midwest area and around the Great Lakes and see what's going to go on here. So I'm going to start first on the next slide with soil moisture conditions. So last summer, much of our service area was in the grip of a severe to extreme drought. Parts of North Dakota and northern Minnesota were even classified as exceptional drought. We did get some timely rainfall up there in the fall, and that did help to increase the soil moisture levels up there. And those areas are now the ones that you see that have white or just maybe a little yellow shading in the upper Midwest. There are still some dry areas that we have, especially from the Dakotas and into Minnesota and Wisconsin. But overall, the soil moisture is much closer to a normal state than it was 6 to 8 months ago when we were in the grips of that drought. This soil moisture map hasn't really changed much since the one we saw 2 weeks ago. Moving on to the next slide, I just want to touch base on snow water and how much snow was on the landscape. This is a snapshot of where we were at 2 weeks ago. This is the graph that we looked at. Now, if we step forward to the next slide, we're going to get a picture of where we're at today. So you can see here now that the snow is pretty much gone over the southern portions of our area. And that was thanks to the warm temperatures and the rainfall event that occurred last week. It gave Jim all his issues in the Ohio Basin, and we had some problems in our southern areas as well. But now, since that system went through, we added a little bit more snow and, of course, snow water content over our far northern areas. The snow water content, as you can see here, as of this map was Wednesday morning, was running 3 to 4 inches generally from eastern North Dakota across the northern half of Minnesota and into northern Wisconsin. The areas that you see in tan there, that's 4 to 5 inches of snow water, and any orange or yellow you see is 5 or up to 8 inches of water content in the snow. And of course, higher than that, the greens are indicating even more. Right around Lake Superior, where 8 to 10 inches of water content or even more are on the landscape. That's actually pretty normal for those areas, but what's really concerning us most right now is all that water that's on the landscape from eastern North Dakota into the northern portions of Minnesota. On the next slide, how does that water content rank? When we look at all this water content as a ranking compared to normal for the ending part of February here, there's 3 distinct areas on this graphic that continue to stand out for us. First of all, the warmer orange and red colors that you see, those indicate low snow water content in the lowest 20% of all the years in our comparison history. So less than normal amounts of snow water content there. And you can see that runs from Iowa across Wisconsin and into parts of lower Michigan. The second area is the band of the blue that you can see there from Illinois into northern Indiana. And that is the remnants of the snow that was down there that's lingering in our modeling. It's either frozen on the landscape or maybe still contained in sheltered areas, Most of the snow is gone, but we do hang on to some of that in our modeling just because some of that water has not yet run through all the rivers down there. And we want to make sure that water is available when we do get that warm up and releases the rest of the water that might be hiding in the sheltered areas down there. The final area that we're looking at is up across North Dakota and northern Minnesota, where you see the dark blues there. Those areas are ranked in the top 10 or 20% of all years in our historical record. And that indicates snow water content that's well above average for this time of year. All right, on the next slide, not surprisingly, our overall flood outlook is directly reflected by how much snow we've got out there right now. Much of our service area, as you can see on this map, is showing about an average risk for flooding. That's indicated by all the green triangles in the southern 2/3 of this graphic. There are a few locations expected to reach flood stage with the orange icons there, a few red icons mixed in. So maybe a few spots might get up to moderate levels, but overall things are pretty much average for much of our area. But things are quite different up in the Hudson Bay drainage. The Red River of the North and its tributaries really have our attention this year, with a good deal of flooding anticipated up there. Perhaps also the lower portions of the Souris River, which is in north central North Dakota. So all those colored icons that you see up there are showing a pretty widespread area where flooding has a greater than 50% chance of occurring. Orange icons indicate primarily minor flooding expected. Red would be moderate flooding, and any purples suggest a greater than 50-50 chance for the flooding reaching a major level. So let's zoom in a little bit on the next slide in the Red River Valley of the North. We're going to start first here. First of all, we're going to start with the Souris River, where you see the arrows moving there. The river starts up in southern Canada and flows from northwest to southeast from the upper left of the image. It goes through the city of Minot, and then it curves back northward and then back up into Canada again. So note that the upper portion of the Souris Basin really has no flooding indicated, and that makes sense because there hasn't been much snow up there this winter, and they've been in a prolonged drought now in that general area for a couple of years now. But in the lower part of the basin, if you remember the graphics we looked at earlier, there's still a good amount of snow water on the landscape in that area, and they also got some of that rainfall in the fall. So if we get 2 to 4 inches of water that's laying in the snow there, and we get that to melt off quickly enough, we could see some flooding in the lower portions of the Souris Basin this spring. But the Red River really has our attention the most. As you can see, there are quite a number of icons indicating moderate or major flooding there. So let's take a look at the red. We're going to zoom in on a 90-day probabilistic graphic that we have. And this one's for Fargo, North Dakota, right along the Red River there. So a couple things I want to point out. Note that the black line with the triangles there is shifted well to the left of the blue line. So the blue line is our typical historical chance for flooding based on all the past events dating back 50, 60 years in our record here. The black line then indicates the chance for flooding when you take into account current conditions, like soil moisture, temperature trends, frozen ground, snow laying on the landscape, etc., things like that. So if you look at this example for Fargo, you can see here that there's a much higher chance for flooding as compared to normal. Looking closely at the numbers, the black line at the 50% probability is well up into the major category, so a 50-50 chance that it's going to be well into major. And the river stage could get up to around 33 feet there. There's a 90% chance even that the river is going to get up to 30 feet, which is right at that major flooding threshold. So a lot of the graphics for the Red River itself are similar to this one, indicating a much higher chance for flooding up there. So there are some other factors that play into how bad flooding can get, and we're going to look at the first one on the next slide here. We're going to talk about frost depth. Something like this is not reflected directly into those outlook graphics that we just looked at, but frost depth can definitely play a role. So we had cold temperatures in late December, and that persisted through January and into February, and that allowed the frost to really penetrate deep in many places. Looking at this graphic, darker shades of blue indicate deep frost, and the lighter colors have a more shallow frost depth. Some examples here: Grand Forks, North Dakota reported a frost depth around 34 inches earlier this week. Aberdeen, South Dakota was at 34 inches. Bismarck had a depth of 41 inches. Up in those areas, quite a bit of wind this winter has blown some areas clear of their snow, and that allowed the cold temperatures to really drive deep in the soils there. So in the areas where there's more drifting and a deeper snow, perhaps the frost isn't quite as deep there. And that's indicated a little bit in, if you look at northeast South Dakota, there's a circle there for Sisseton, South Dakota, and then that stretches into central Minnesota. The frost depth in those locations is only 7 or 8 inches, and they have more snow on the ground in those spots, and that's providing a blanket, keeping the ground insulated from that deep cold air. So the frost does vary across the region, but in general runs some 15 to 30 inches deep in most spots, especially with all the blue colored icons you can see there in Wisconsin. One other thing that we worry about is river ice, and Jim touched on this a little bit when he discussed his area, and we'll move on to the next slide. There we go. So the cold conditions that we had really drove pretty far south in January, and that caused widespread ice to form. And a lot of that ice caused difficulties for shipping, especially along the Illinois River, as well as parts of the Mississippi River. We talked about it last time as being a possibility, but now we're having actually some ice jam problems as a result of all those warm temperatures and rain last week. Across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, up into lower Michigan, the runoff from that rapid melt and the rain caused pretty rapid rises on the creeks and rivers, and that helped pop some of that ice free, and then it broke up and ran downstream, and then it often would get jammed up on bridge crossings, sharp bends in the river, fallen trees, or any other kind of restriction in the river channel. We've had reports of numerous ice jams this past week, as many as 8 or 10 that I can recall, causing some localized flooding in those areas. Some of that still lingers even today. So this risk is going to continue until we can get all the ice out of the system. And that risk will also continue further north, where ice still remains in the rivers as we get our warmer weather spreading northward in the coming weeks. All right, so in summary on my last slide here, overall, the risk for this spring for flooding is generally about average for most of our region, the exception being the Red River Valley, where the risk is above normal up there. The indication is that for areas where we do get flooding, most of it should remain minor. There'll be a few spots reaching perhaps moderate levels, but up in the Red River Valley, we're expecting more moderate or even perhaps major flooding to occur up there. We also do still have that risk for some ice jam flooding, as we just discussed, and as usual, any future precipitation and how the temperatures play out this spring are really going to determine just how bad the flooding can get this spring. And that's it for me. So from here, I'll pass it off to Kevin Lau down at Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
All righty, thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish to start out by saying that there is an overall reduced flood risk across the Missouri Basin this spring. And to help illustrate that, I would direct you to the left-hand graphic there showing a map of our basin. The 400 plus forecast locations within the Missouri River Basin are depicted as colored dots, and they're a little bit hard to see, but the color of the dots indicates the percent difference of flood risk for that given location this year as compared to the flood risk for the past 30 years. Blue dots indicate a reduction in flood risk as compared to historical. Red dots indicate an enhanced risk for flooding. And also to aid in visualization, I've shaded in larger areas where chances predominate in one direction or the other. An example of a 90-day stage probability distribution is given on the right-hand side of this slide. It's just like the graphic that Mike showed earlier. When you compare where the historic distribution crosses the minor flood category against where today's conditional line crosses minor flood category, you can see that there's about a 20% reduction in the probability to reach flood stage this spring. And it's these gaps, these differences that we are plotting on that map to the left. So when looking at the map on the left, you can see that there's large areas within the Missouri Basin where flood risk is reduced from normal by 10 to 30%. That's the blue shaded area. There is a somewhat enhanced risk for flooding shown in the eastern Dakotas there. That may be a bit overdone, but due to the snowpack and also frozen ground conditions that Mike alluded to earlier, there is a little better than normal chance for flooding in that yellow area there in the eastern Dakotas. Now, a word of caution: reduction or enhancement of flood risk is not the whole story. It doesn't tell you whether or not we do expect a particular location to see flood or not. Decreased or increased flood risk simply tells you which way we're leaning. And I'll get to that in a later slide where I will pinpoint those basins where we do expect flooding this spring. But for now, I just want to leave you with the idea that flood risk overall for this coming spring in the Missouri Basin is reduced. So with the next slide, we'll look at the mountains. Mountain runoff is important to the Missouri River Basin, as mountain runoff contributes about 30% of the annual runoff. This this graphic, courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or the NRCS, shows the mountainous basin snowpack condition in percent of average snow water equivalent. Again, that's the amount of the liquid that's held in the pack. Mountain snowpack can be categorized as being near to below average this year. By this point in the winter, we've normally accumulated about 75% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent. So we still have a little ways to go, but I believe that the 2022 mountain snowpack picture is coming into focus. And moving to the next slide, this mountain snowpack condition leads us to this, what I'm showing here. This slide summarizes the runoff potential that exists for the mountains this year. The Missouri Basin River Forecast Center issues water supply forecasts for approximately 40 locations in the mountainous west. Those are denoted by the circles there. We issue water supplies sort of like what the NRCS does, but we use a different method. This graphic shows that our latest projections of the April through September runoff volume is going to be below normal this runoff year. And again, that's speaking about volumes, and that's for the period April through September. As a side note, we do not expect significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone this year. Moving to the plains with the next slide, this graphic here is courtesy of the Office of Water Prediction. And we see that while plain snowpack is covering a lot of the Missouri Basin, it's really rather shallow. The only significant snow water that we have is there in eastern North Dakota and a little bit of extreme northeastern South Dakota. And the highest reports are in the 3+ inch range. And so moving now to the next slide, and this is the one that everyone's concerned about. And this graphic shows where we do expect flooding over the next 3 months. So we do expect moderate level flooding along the middle reach of the James River, extending from the North Dakota, South Dakota state line down through about Stratford. We also expect minor level flooding in the upper reach of the Big Sioux there in northeast South Dakota. And minor level flooding is possible in the upper reach of the Little Sioux River there in Iowa. Focusing now on the lower basin, minor to moderate flooding is expected along many of the tributaries in extreme eastern Kansas and across the state of Missouri. And this is nothing new. Thunderstorm activity drives springtime flooding in this area of the basin. In fact, we just experienced minor flooding in the Gasconade River Basin, which is located there in the Missouri Ozarks, just this past weekend. Just goes to show that we can have flooding any time of the year in the Missouri Basin. And although not explicitly pointed out in this graphic, flooding is not likely along the Missouri River downstream of Gavin's Point during the next 90 days. However, flood chances do increase for the main stem Missouri below Gavin's Point along about late May into early July. And although that's really not a flood or a spring flood outlook, we do expect episodic on again, off again minor flooding along the main stem Missouri River in the reach extending from Nebraska City to the mouth. but again, that's later on this year. So in summary then, spring flood risk for the Missouri Basin is reduced for this year. Mountain snowpack is slightly below average so far. Plain snowpack is pretty much non-existent, with the exception of eastern North Dakota and extreme northeastern South Dakota. Frost depths, that was mentioned by Mike earlier. Frost depths are impressive. We've got 41 inches in Bismarck, 34 in Aberdeen, 20 inches in Sioux Falls. However, given the drought conditions that have led up, we suspect that the soil, while indeed cold, can still absorb some of the runoff, whether it be from snow melt, where we do have snow, or future rain events. One possible exception to that is in the eastern Dakotas, where precipitation that fell in October, December, and January did benefit the soil moisture, especially in the eastern portion of North Dakota. It's possible that the available soil moisture, when the cold temperatures set in, could have produced a frozen ground condition in that eastern Dakotas area. This, along with the presence of plains snow, helps to explain why we're calling for flooding along the James and the Big Sioux. Dry and mild conditions also lead us to believe that we have an overall lower than normal ice jam breakup flood risk this spring. It's not to say that ice jam flood risk is not existent. Elevated stages due to river ice action have already been reported along several of the rivers in the north and western part of the basin. Impacts thus far, however, have been localized and minor. While ice jam induced flooding will remain possible in the northern and western areas of the Missouri River Basin for the next few weeks, we may have witnessed the season's ice out over the southern portion of the basin. However, as I say that, we did have some ice action along the lower Platte River this morning at the confluence with the Missouri. So I think a lot of the ice in the southern portion has moved out, but the cold snap over the past couple of days has reintroduced some ice creation. Thunderstorm activity typically drives flooding in the lower basin, and so we are expecting episodic minor to moderate flooding this spring across southeastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, southern Iowa, and the state of Missouri. For the Missouri River itself, the best chances for flooding will be later on in late May through early July, where again, on again, off again flooding is likely from Neb City to the mountain. Thank you, and that concludes my comments, and I'll pass it along to Lee at the Arkansas Red.
Thank you, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to jump right in and start going over the Arkansas Red Basin's current conditions. Starting in Colorado, this plot shows the snow water equivalent of the subbasins within the Arkansas River Basin. As of this morning, the entire Arkansas River Basin in Colorado was at 86% of average. If you remember from the drought monitor map earlier, much of Colorado is in significant drought. Snow accumulation in the Arkansas Basin in Colorado typically peaks at the beginning of May, so we still have a couple of months to add to the snowpack. River flooding from snowmelt alone in the Arkansas Basin of Colorado is infrequent, and the chances are fairly low again this season. On the next slide, on the left, I have our liquid precipitation estimates over the past 90 days with respect to normal. As you can see, it's been pretty dry, continuing a trend from 2021. Most of the basins saw less than 75% of normal precipitation. You can also see that it's a little wetter across the eastern reaches of our basin. That area has seen increased precipitation over the last few weeks, as is typical for the season. On the right is the latest drought monitor focusing on the Arkansas Red Basin. Much of our basin is experiencing significant drought. The next slide shows the status of Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs in our area, showing the amount of flood storage available. All of these reservoirs are in really good shape, with many lakes having their entire flood pool available. Within the Corps' Tulsa district, The Arkansas River system and the Red River system are each using about 2% of their total flood storage. On our next slide, we have the long-range forecast of rivers in the Arkansas Red Basin through April. The Poto River in eastern Oklahoma has a greater than 50% chance of moderate and minor flooding during that time. If we were to look on out into May, there are a couple of other rivers in our area that will be near that 50% threshold. These include the Neosho River in northeast Oklahoma and the Illinois River in eastern Oklahoma. It should be noted that these rivers are the usual ones that have a higher chance of flooding in any given year, so this is not out of the ordinary. So in summary, despite the current dry conditions experienced across our basin, we are calling for a near normal flood potential across the Arkansas Red Basin. As a reminder, rainfall and seasonal thunderstorms will ultimately determine the final outcome of our flood risk. With that, I'll pass it on to Jeff Groschel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
All righty, thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll talk about the Lower Mississippi River Basin on the next slide here. So currently right now, we've had a pretty good amount of rainfall over the last couple of weeks across the area, with anywhere between 2 to 7 inches of rainfall that's fallen over portions of Arkansas, southern Missouri, and into the Tennessee Valley. So we've got quite a few locations, probably 20 to 30 locations that are in the minor to moderate category currently at this time. Quite a bit different that we had 2 weeks ago, where we really didn't have much in the flooding at all. And even just having 20 to 30 locations in flood, that's pretty typical of this for our area for this time of year. Anytime we do get rain in February across our area, we do get a lot of locations in minor and moderate flooding across our area. So we'll go to the next slide here and talk about the Mississippi River. For the Mississippi River, we do got a floodway that's moving down the lower part of the Ohio at this time. We're looking at kind of cresting conditions for where the junction of the Ohio and the Mississippi come together at Cairo, Illinois. Probably not looking to crest there until sometime the very beginning of March, on March 1st. And that's going to take probably 2 to 3 weeks before that makes its way down through the lower part of the Mississippi River. We're expecting just minor to moderate flooding right now in the lower part of the Ohio, and we may get a little bit of minor flooding on a couple of locations above Memphis, Tennessee. The rest of the lower part of the river, though, is going to be well below flood stage, and we're not anticipating any problems just with this wave that we currently have in the river. And it's basically the levels that we're looking at are pretty similar to what we had in 2021 in March of last year. But because of having the wave on the Ohio River and things elevated, especially on the lower part of the Ohio, we are looking at potential for more minor to moderate flooding through winter and spring for the lower part of the Ohio. And then probably as we get down on the lower part of the Mississippi or so, probably looking at more in the minor category for the lower portions of the river. And then we'll turn it over to the next slide here and talk about Tennessee and North Alabama. You're not seeing a lot of colors located on this map here, but we do have minor to moderate flooding that's occurring right now, especially in the middle portions of Tennessee with the ongoing rainfall that we have in that area. So right now, we're looking at good potential for minor and maybe even some more widespread moderate flooding over portions like the Elk and Duck River systems across Middle Tennessee. But then a lot of the other little tributaries going into the Tennessee River in northern Alabama, and then some of the tributaries going into the Mississippi and western Tennessee. We're also looking at minor to some isolated moderate flooding over the next several months. And we'll switch to the next slide. For Arkansas and Missouri, the areas of probably the greatest concern are going to be in the northeast parts of Arkansas and the southeastern parts of Missouri. Those are the areas that have really gotten the most of the rainfall over the last several weeks. So we are looking for minor to moderate flooding across those areas, and specifically like the Black River, St. Francis River, and then portions of the lower part of the White River systems in Arkansas. But in the southern parts of Arkansas, we've had drought conditions for a number of months now. So the Ouachita Basin, we're really only looking at maybe some minor flooding across those areas. Typically, we would get minor to moderate in that area. But right now, with the low water conditions, we're probably only looking at minor flooding conditions in the lower part of Arkansas and on the Ouachita Basin. And then switching to the next slide. For Louisiana and Mississippi, been a little bit drier in these areas, specifically in Louisiana. Areas like the Ouachita and Red Basins and the Calcasieu are really and have had pretty significant drought conditions for a number of months now. So we're really not anticipating a whole lot of flooding, although any rainstorm that we do get during the spring and winter time can give us some minor flooding. But right now we're only kind of looking at minor flooding for those areas. Further to the east into Mississippi, we've had a little bit more rainfall, so basins like the Yazoo, the Pearl River, the Big Black, and even the Pascagoula, we're anticipating right now minor flooding and maybe some isolated flooding in a few locations across that area. And then go to the last slide. In summary, the flood risk that we have for the area is characterized as above normal for the Middle Tennessee and the Lower Ohio valleys, and really near normal for the rest of our area. Minor to moderate flooding will be possible for the Mississippi basins and the tributaries going into it, but that's pretty typical for our area as well. Obviously, just like others have noted, rainfall is really the key as to what that final outcome will be for the flood risk for the winter and spring. And with that, I will switch it back over to Katie at the National Water Center.
All right, thank you, Jeff, and all of the representatives from the River Forecast Centers. On this last summary slide here, I'm just going to try and summarize everything from all of the River Forecast Centers. So in that graphic there, you can see the 50% or greater chance of flooding, those long-range outlooks for the entire greater Mississippi Basin there. So the flood risk is considered above normal for much of the Ohio and Middle Tennessee valleys, and then also up on the Red River of the North there. It is also normal to above normal for portions of the James, and significant flooding due to mountain snowmelt and runoff alone is not likely as we get further west there. However, as you've heard throughout the entire presentation, and especially as we get into these warmer months here, the amount of snowmelt and the frequency, intensity, and extent of rainfall going forward is going to determine the final outcome of the flood risk across the entire basin. Thank you so much for your participation in today's webinar. We are going to send out this recording in an email along with an invite to the next third webinar that is on March 10th, Thursday, March 10th. But for now, stick around if you have a question. We are going to go into our question and answer session. So a reminder to use that question box there in the GoToWebinar GUI if you have a question for one of our presenters today. All right, looks like we've got our first question. So what are the chances of the Bonnie Carey spillway being used this year?
Well, I think it's really too early to say whether it would or not be opened and stuff. I think right now, based on the current conditions that we have in the system, you would say no, but certainly all it takes is a good 10 to 15-inch rainfall that falls over the Ohio Valley or Mississippi Valley and Missouri Valley and stuff to change that. So I just don't think that we have enough information to be able to determine whether that would be the case or not as far as the Corps having to open up the Bonnie Carey spillway.
All right, thanks for that, Jeff. All right, I'm not seeing any questions in the question box at this time. If something comes up afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. But otherwise, we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening, and we will see you again on this webinar in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone.